Then they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. And they divided up his garments among themselves, casting lots for them to decide what each man should take. It was the third hour when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified two robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. And the scripture was fulfilled which says, "And he was numbered with the transgressors." Those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads and saying, "Ha! You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes, were mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let this Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him were also insulting him. When the 6th hour came, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they began saying, "Behold, he is calling out for Elijah." Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry, and he breathed his last. And the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion who was standing right in front of him saw the way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." I bring us back to Mark chapter 15, and I remind you of the fact that Jesus is alone. And we've seen a series of moments when he has been alone. This is not the final alone moment that he has in his life. I find it very intriguing that we have this statement that comes in verse 32, that those who were crucified him were also insulting him. In other words, Jesus was completely alone. He didn't even have allies among those who share his same fate. I remind you of the overall flow of what happens here, the series of acts and then the responses. We had 4 acts, 4 responses. We're going to look at the last 2, Act 3, crucifixion, the crowds and the high priest, death and veil, and the centurion. But I'm not going to look at all of it. I want to look at some particular elements as we walk through the crucifixion of Christ. And it's really tough because, you know, when there is something that is so familiar to you, it's very hard for at times to have it impact your heart and to affect how you are, or to shake up your life. And there are certain things that as believers we're so familiar with that sometimes we just go through it so routinely that it really has very little effect upon us. And I really wrestled this week in so many different ways, but one of the ways I wrestled is I just did not want this to be same old for my own heart as I walk through this passage together. I know the story, I know what happened, and we can walk through it and become so desensitized to it. We romanticize it even, but I really was challenging myself just to look at the context and the truths that are laid out here. But the difficulty is that with the passing of time, oftentimes our perspective changes. The farther that we are removed from the first century, the harder it is for us to understand the compelling irony of statements that we find, such as 1 Corinthians 1:18, "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." You see, the early church, when they would have heard this, the irony of it, the starkness of it, the shockingness of it, right? They would have been stirred by this statement, but it's so familiar to us and we're so far removed, but sometimes it doesn't have the impact that it ought to have upon us. I mean, we can almost liken it today that if we walked around wearing on our necklaces and earrings the guillotine or the electric chair, somehow we have to come to an understanding of what is happening here with Christ. And oftentimes when we come to the crucifixion, it leads us to become disinterested, and we speak of it in a very disinterested way, or we become desensitized to the reality of the crucifixion, and we even romanticize it. Even at times that we picture it like a painting of Michelangelo, we see the drama, but somehow it's still so abstract to us. And I really this morning don't want to overkill in dealing with the death of Christ. I really want to just focus on what Mark focuses on, but at the same time, somehow the impact of what happens on the cross must come to our lives. And it must move our hearts because there's so much to learn from it. The proper perspective, it's tough, I know, because we are surrounded, the landscape is filled with crosses and crucifixes to the point that we don't even see them, much less get moved by their images. It's not so for the early church when Jesus talked to the disciples and the people around and says, "If you want to come behind me and follow in my footsteps, you must deny yourself and take up your cross." That was a powerful statement. A shocking statement. It really doesn't move us the same way. Sometimes we think about, I get the flu and it's a really bad case of the flu or something, and we hear someone say, well, it's my cross to bear. But that's not what he's talking about at all. But we diminish it to that. So we must steel ourselves against being desensitized towards the crucifixion of Christ. We don't want to develop this morbid idea and sense of the gore of the cross, but we don't want to be shallow and sentimental when we come to look at the crucifixion. We need to allow the agony of Christ to have an impact on us. We don't want to become dispassionate when we look at the issue of the crucifixion of Christ. And there are some powerful truths that are revealed here for us, and especially in the way that Christ goes through this. Because the reality of it is that Christ and His sufferings have always been and shall always be a window into His heart and into the heart of God. There are so many, we could call them revelations from the cross. There's so much to gain from going through this passage. So much for us to learn, and I pray that we don't miss at least the things that we will look at this morning together. Because it's crucial for us to understand Christ. As His disciples, we need to understand the role of the cross, and we need to understand the revelation of the cross. And so some of the things that I'd like to look at in regards to this passage this morning as we walk through a passage that is oftentimes so familiar, is oftentimes so distant from us. But these are some pretty amazing truths that are revealed for us in regards to the crucifixion of Christ. First, I'd like to look at the crucifixion's revelation of the role of the cross. And I don't want to overdevelop this thought and to get too morbid and too graphic and so on, because Mark doesn't do that for us. But at the same time, we need to understand the significance of the cross. What was its intent, and what was Mark's perspective when he records this account for us? Because it's not always the same in all of the gospel writers. So first, a look at the role of the cross in the Roman Empire. And I'll just tell you that Mark he's not going to unnecessarily focus on the horror of Jesus' sufferings. We've already seen the Garden of Gethsemane. He's not going to get into all the details of the physical aspect that Christ went through on the cross. At the same time, he does not understate it, and he doesn't hold things back. He makes it very clear to us what is taking place on the cross. But it's amazing because notice with me in verse 20, he makes this statement. After they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off of him, and they put his own garments on him, and they led him out to crucify him. With such an objective statement he makes in regards to the crucifixion. Cicero describes it as the most cruel and horrifying punishment, and he says it so matter-of-factly. They're leading him off to crucify him. Mark doesn't have to emotionalize the passage because for the church in those days and for his readers, likely believers in Rome, they didn't need him to emotionalize it. They understood what was happening when he talked about the cross, and they understood the gruesomeness of it and the gore of it and the painfulness of it. This was without a doubt Rome's terror apparatus, and every totalitarian regime has one. It was infamous for his infliction of torture and disgrace upon the victim, and it is the second aspect that Mark is going to focus on. But the crucifixion was a punishment that was reserved for those who were non-Roman citizens. They would not crucify a Roman citizen, and it was used for the lowest classes. It was used for slaves and violent criminals and prisoners of war, but they would never use such a means of putting punishment on anyone who was a Roman citizen as this. It was too painful, but it was too disgraceful. The crucifixion was the mean of punishment by Crassus at the defeat of the slave rebellion under Spartacus in 71 BC, when 6,000 slaves were crucified along the Via Appia between Capua and Rome. This was something that was used for those who did not matter in society. It wasn't just the pain, as excruciating as it was. It was about the shamefulness of it. It was about the scandalousness of it. It was about how it was socially degrading. And this is what Mark focuses on. And this is so amazing to me because when I look at the cross and I look at it from Mark's perspective as he records these events, I realize the vulnerability of Christ on the cross. And in all of this process, he lays himself out there and he is exposed even to the ridicule and the mockery. And what's even more amazing is his response to it all, which is nothing. It's nothing. I will finish with these final thoughts in regards to Christ's response to this, but it is just staggering to me. It wasn't just about the pain, it was about the shame. And this is what Mark focuses on, going all the way back to chapter 14, verse 65, when Jesus first appears before the religious leaders, when they spit on him and they struck him, they mocked him, they disgraced him. Mark is going to carry that thought all the way into this section as he deals with the crucifixion, where we have the mocking of the soldiers as they dress him up in a robe and put a crown of thorns on his head, and they acclaim him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they mockingly bow down before him while they hit him with the reed and they spit upon him. For Mark, it wasn't just about the physical pain, it was about the shame. What's amazing is the vulnerability of Christ in all of this. His willingness to go through this. Mark carries this all the way through the account. We have the mocking accusation that is nailed to the cross, verse 26, and no doubt this was sick humor as they nailed this sign above his head as he hung upon the cross, "The King of the Jews." This was no sense of respect whatsoever in doing this, and yet at the same time, it was declaring the truth before the world. The mocking of the bystanders as he hung upon the cross, and the passers-by that went by and saw him there, they mocked him as he hung there on the cross. The religious leaders followed in the process, and they also mocked him. And then, if you add insult to injury, even those who were suffering the same fate as he also insulted him while he hung there on the cross. And yet he opened himself up to this. This is the one amazing thing about this account that has so struck me, was the vulnerability of Christ. And I'll just tell you, oftentimes when we think vulnerability, we think weakness. There was no weakness here at all. It was vulnerability and strength. If I can picture it this way for you, and don't hang too tightly upon the structure, but just let me give you little purview of how Mark lays out the episode for us in this account. He begins with Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross, 15:21. He ends with the centurion and the confession of Christ, 15:39. It's a very climactic moment. We have wine offered to him and his garments divided, and then he is crucified. And there are so many echoes. If you read through this passage, go back and read through Psalm 22. And all the different elements of connection between here and Psalm 22. But notice what happens in verses 36 through 38. We have the vinegar offered, then the veil of the temple torn, and the crucifixion. We have the third hour and the sign that is nailed above his head, King of the Jews. We have the sixth hour, then the ninth hour, my God, my God. And then we have the two robbers that bracket here. We have the mocking of the passers-by and the mocking of the religious leaders. For Mark, it wasn't just about the physical pain. It was about the scandal. It was about the shame. It was about the degradation. And the taunts, without a doubt, were aimed at this, because how can such a one who is dying in such a degrading way upon the cross, how can such a one be called the Messiah, and how can he save anyone when he cannot save himself? But how little they knew, how little they understood, how little they saw of the real revelation that was happening on the cross. How oftentimes we miss the revelations of the cross when we look at this passage over and over again. Cicero said the very word cross should be far removed, not only from a person of a Roman citizen, but from his thoughts. A 2nd century Gnostic Basilides, he was so aghast at the idea of a crucified Messiah that he invented the notion that Simon of Cyrene was the one who died on the cross and not Jesus, because there was so much shame involved in the process of crucifixion. We have a hard time understanding this, not living in that time, but I pray that we come to a little bit of a sense of understanding of how shameful this was and how degrading this moment was. There is no doubt that Mark has shown us the role of the cross in the relation of discipleship. In this gospel, it is the distinguishing mark of a disciple, taking up one's cross and following Jesus. And we find Jesus bringing it to its ultimate end, verse 37. And Jesus uttered a loud cry, and he breathed his last, and he walked the walk, and he died upon that cross. And the thing that Mark challenges us with all the way back in the first statement that Christ makes in chapter 8 and his challenge to come and follow in his footsteps is he's not looking for some symbolic gesture. He is looking for a concrete following of Jesus Christ. And some have suggested that Simon Cyrene is an example of this, that he symbolizes, and this event symbolizes as they pull him out of the crowd, verse 21, as they pull him out of the crowd and they have him bear his cross, that somehow this symbolized the fact that Simon of Cyrene now is walking in the path of a disciple of Jesus Christ. I don't think that that is necessarily the case that is being brought out here. Nonetheless, it is an illustration, but ultimately Christ shows us the example of what it looks like to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. All the disciples around him said, yeah, we're with you, we're going to go there. But in the end, it was he and he alone who went to the end. It is striking, though, with Simon of Cyrene and the mention that comes, because we know that names are not something that Mark just throws around. You know, there are those who like to drop names, right? Hey, you know, I know so-and-so, right? And they want to put out all the names. Mark isn't that way. When Mark uses a name, it's for a specific reason. And he is the only one who mentions the sons of Simon of Cyrene. He is the only one who mentions Alexander and Rufus. He speaks of Simon as though he is not known, but the way that he words it, he reflects the fact that Alexander and Rufus are both known. And if we go back to Romans chapter 16, verse 13, we have Rufus that is mentioned, and likely that is the same Rufus. In other words, it is very likely that Alexander and Rufus became believers and they were a part of the church in Rome. And if that is true, then there is no doubt that likely this event in Simon of Cyrene's life had an impact within his household. But nonetheless, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ is a concrete example of what it means to carry the cross. The crucifixion, its revelation of his kingship. We mentioned this before as we began to look at this passage, but there are several clues in chapter 15 that Mark intends us to understand the trial and crucifixion as this royal enthronement of Jesus the Messiah, but we're not to overemphasize it, but nonetheless there are elements that bear this out. We talked about this before, about the royalty references that happen throughout here, the reference to Jesus as the King of the Jews. And we have reference to the royalty during the scourging, the purple robe, the crown of thorns, hail, King of the Jews, the references of the mocking bystanders as the King of Israel. And this is intriguing because the first reference, King of the Jews, would be used by the Romans. This one is used by the religious leaders. They're not going to call him by that. But over and over, Mark is going to highlight this one fact. And it's also significant and very intriguing thought that you have reference to the two on either side of Jesus. Might want us to take our minds back to the time of James and John, yes, when they asked Jesus if they could have the privilege of one being on his right and the other being on his left. There is no doubt that Mark is highlighting something here, but we do not want to overstate the royal messianic theme that runs through here, because that is not his overall focus. The concept of Messiah in Mark's gospel is a subsidiary concept. His preeminent focus on Christ was that He is the Son of God. Hence the affirmation that comes from the very lips of Jesus Christ when He is on trial before the Sanhedrin and He affirms the fact of who He is. I am, as they ask Him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One, the Son of God? For Mark, Messiah was a functional concept, but the Son of God was an ontological one. In other words, it revealed the true deity of Jesus Christ. The Gospel is bracketed by this. He begins in chapter 1, verse 1, with reference to the fact that He is the Son of God. And then we move finally to this climactic moment by the centurion as he looks at him, and this staggering statement that comes. Notice verse 39. When the centurion who was standing right in front of him, notice, saw the way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. How do you get that from that? We could miss this, but Mark all along in his gospel has been leading us this way. As the demons speak out and say that He is the Son of God, He silences them, He rebukes them. It is not their place to call out His identity before the world. The only one who does so is God the Father, and He is not hushed. And the only time that Christ refers to Himself is in the parable that He tells in chapter 12. And finally now, a human being is going to declare the fact He is the Son of God when he sees Him breathe His last breath. Such a powerful moment. Mark's gospel has been driving to this point, and we dare not miss it. The veil in the temple is torn in two, and we have a centurion declaring the true identity of Jesus Christ, while all the others of His people and the religious leaders stand around and mock Him and not see Him for who He is. Finally, the crucifixion's revelation of His substitutionary atonement, the selfless death of Christ. The willingness to do this for the sake of others. The taunting helps to bring this element out, as we find in verse 30. The bystanders, as they walk along, verse 29, and likely is because they would crucify the criminals and whoever. They would crucify them on crosses along major thoroughfares where people would pass by. And so here we have the notation, the passers-by hurling abuse at Him and wagging their heads in disgust. Verse 30, save yourself and come down from the cross, they say. And in the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes, were mocking Him among themselves and saying, He saved others, He cannot save Himself. The taunts come literally, if you will, save yourself, having come down from the cross. Others He saved, Himself He cannot save. I've often understood in a sense, the suffering, the physical aspect of the crucifixion. I did a message sometime back from the Gospel of John, and I walked through the fact that Christ truly died, and I walked through all the physical aspects of his suffering, from the beatings to the Garden of Gethsemane, to the cross, the nailing of the cross, and all that it had, the impact that it had upon his body, even looking at physicians and what they would say as they described the event and all the things that would go through him physically. But yet this is the first time that I've really stopped and looked at the internal emotional aspect of Christ upon the cross and the crucifixion, the shame that went along with it, not just the pain. And again, the vulnerability of Christ to go through this. The willingness to embrace the will of the Father and to expose himself, not just to the abuse physically, but to the mocking of the crowds as they pass by. Seeking not his own honor, seeking not his own self-defense. He's hanging there not for the sake of self, but for the sake of others. And no doubt, like the skeptics, the religious leaders, they will believe only if they see, they say. What? I just need the empirical proof, you see. If you just come down off the cross, then I'll really believe, because seeing is believing, right? This is very much like chapter 8, verses 11 through 13, when the religious leaders asked Jesus, just one more sign from heaven so that we might know. And clearly in both of those passages, this one here and that one in chapter 8, clearly it's a reflection of unbelief. And you could say, well, that's obvious, Steve, because that's why they're asking for the sign. They don't believe. But here's the significance about this in the Gospel of Mark. Mark, faith is not the result of signs and miracles. It is the condition for them. Go with me to Mark chapter 6. As I remind you of the episode when Jesus comes to his hometown. Chapter 6, verses 1 and following. Jesus went out from there and he came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. Verse 2, when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many listeners were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? And what is this wisdom given to him? And such miracles as these performed by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? They could only see his humanity. Right? Aren't his brothers, James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are they not here? Are not his sisters with us? And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to him, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his own relatives and in his own household. And he could do no miracle there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he wondered at their what? Unbelief. How many times we cry out for that empirical evidence for our faith? Paul talks about hope in Romans. That is no hope if you can see what is hoped for. Yes? Hebrews and the issue of faith. 2 Corinthians, the same. The things that are seen are not reality. It is the things that are unseen is where reality lies. We find ourselves falling into the same snare as the rest of the world. Show me and I'll believe. No, believe in who I am. For Mark, the faith he encourages for his readers is not compelled by sight, but evoked by the person of Jesus Christ. The reality is that even if he did come on off the cross, they would not believe. Jesus knew this when they asked in chapter 8, and that is why he did not perform another sign. The reality of these taunts, they assume that salvation of self is the greatest good. In other words, the surest vindication of a would-be Messiah is therefore in his ability to save himself. This thing is so amazing about the act of Christ. The lack of self-preservation. He allowed the entirety of his being to go through this. Garden of Gethsemane, the internal wrestling and the struggle, the agonizing, not just the physical, but the spiritual, the emotional, and dare I say psychological, all of those aspects, the entirety of his being, to be exposed to what God the Father wanted him to go through, to do this for the sake of others, to meet the needs of others. The greatest good is not the salvation of self, and yet it's amazing. It's amazing to me how we are also so driven by this fact in the church. Self-preservation. What are we saving ourselves for? What am I saving myself for? Why am I so unwilling to be vulnerable for the sake of someone else's salvation? The reality is that if he had saved himself, he could not save anyone else. He had to stay on that cross to save others. Jesus did not take upon himself a mission of self-help and self-fulfillment. He was there to be a ransom for others. He exposed himself not just to the physical aspect, to the mocking, to the disgrace, to the shame, to the degradation for the salvation of others. How often have I been vulnerable for something like that? How often have I exposed myself for the sake of leading someone else to Christ? I couldn't help but think about 2 Corinthians when Paul says to the church of Corinth, our hearts stand in the state of being open to you. And that's always a befuddling statement to me, because there was a church that he received so much persecution from. So much challenge against him personally, against his ministry. And over accusations came. I mean, even personally, like, this guy can't even preach. And have you seen him? He looks like a schmuck. He can't be an apostle. And how can someone be so weak and go through so much suffering and so much toil? How can they be used of God? It's not possible. All the ridicule and the taunts that came to him. And he still says in the midst of all that, my heart stands in the state of being open to you. I am willing to be vulnerable to more exposure to your mocking and taunting if this is what it takes for you to draw closer to Christ. He learned the lesson of the cross of Christ. I'm not willing to do that. Are you? So over the years of ministry, I've seen those who open themselves up and make themselves vulnerable. And I've seen the attacks that come and how people misabuse that. And it's usually those who say, I want you to be more real. And as you're more real, then you're more exposed. And then they take advantage of that to exalt themselves, to build themselves up and tear you down. So see, the natural response is, I'm just going to close myself off to everybody, you see. No more vulnerability, no more openness, no more willingness to go through the pain and the suffering and the taunts. It's easy to shroud our life. It's easy to close the doors, lock them, keep everybody else and leave a nice sanitary life. But that is not the life of the cross. We have such nice antiseptic lives, such sterile lives, such closed off lives. And really, so unfulfilled lives in the plan of God. When we shut ourselves off from being used by God to fulfill His will in the way that Christ did. You see, everything about Christ was totally anti who we are in America. I don't know about you, but as walking through the Gospels, I'm constantly being challenged with the fact that my conceptions of God and the way He does things are not exactly in line with the way that God does things. You see, how He accomplishes it is not the way that I would accomplish my end. For me to reach glorification would not be through the pathway of suffering and self-rejection and denying of myself. For me, my pathway to glory is about self-preservation. Keep myself away from all pain and all suffering and all injury and any kind of affliction in this life until finally I reach glory. And that's the way to it, and that's not the way to it. I still laugh. When Paul goes through to encourage the disciples, he's going to encourage them and build them up. Through many trials and tribulations, we will enter the kingdom of God. We expect through many rose fields and fluffy clouds, we will enter the kingdom of God. But that's not the way of the cross. Jesus didn't give in to the taunts, but he definitely completed the offering. In this haunting scene of Jesus fastened to a cross and assailed in mockery, we see proof of the startling difference between God's way and everything that men consider to be their goal and conceive of as being God's way. I mean, the words that come out of Christ's mouth when he teaches the disciples, look at the Beatitudes. It's nothing of this world. It's not just different, it's radically different. The way he lived his life wasn't just different, it was radically different. He could despise sin, hated sin, but died for the sinner, surrendered his rights for the sinner, exposed himself for the sinner, became vulnerable for the sinner. Jesus offers no self-defense. 2 times we find him utter words, one before the Sanhedrin, the other before Pilate, affirming the reality of who he is. After that, no more words, no more defense. Man, when the degradation starts and people start mocking us, what do? Right into self-defense. Right into self-defense. That's the natural way. This is not the way of the cross. There's no effort to get even, not even to get in the final word. How self-centered are we? When we get into arguments with people, we still, even when the argument's over, we'll walk away and in our mind we'll reason till we won the argument and the fight in our own mind. We cannot help but win. It's all about self. Jesus in our marriages, right? Got to get in the final word. I got to be the one who's right. I got to defend myself. There was no attempt to preserve at least not even a modicum of dignity and pride as he hung upon that cross. Could he have called down myriads of angels? Absolutely. Could he have caused the earth to open up and swallow all of those bystanders and mockers alive? Absolutely. Even if it seems as though somebody is attacking our dignity and pride, we get an ire over it. Jesus surrenders in total vulnerability to the malevolence and violence of the world to fulfill the will of God for the sake of others. There's so much here, but this is the one thing that has struck me and I have wrestled with this week and will continue to wrestle with. It's the vulnerable life that the cross calls for. It is the willingness to be exposed for the sake of other salvation. It's the willingness to set all of my rights and privileges, myself, aside for the sake of others. If you want to come and follow behind me in my steps, you must deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. That is the way of the Master. Let's pray. Dad, would you close in word of prayer, please?